So yeah, I guess the where that leaves me is the parable of the Good Samaritan, and that's where I end in the chapter as well. I've seen over the course of 2 years Christianity Today helping people pass by on the other side of the road as Gaza is in the ditch, as Gaza is clearly crying out for help.
Hey friends, you might have heard of Christianity Today, a well-known premier American evangelical magazine known for its moderate evangelical position on culture and politics. Was founded by Billy Graham, the well-known evangelical evangelist. Has usually been positioned as a very good and moderate magazine, and yet has adopted a very problematic, essentialist, anti-Palestinian discourse when it comes to the genocide in Gaza for the last 2 years. So in this episode, I'm joined by Ben Norquist, an American researcher and author who has done some work on Christianity Today, and we tackle the discourse it has taken in its publications, in its podcast, and a very harmful discourse that has to be tackled, has to be confronted. And hopefully Christianity Today would listen to this and would do better instead of adopting very lazy, essentialist, and anti-Palestinian positions, but fundamentally positions that really harm its witness and its credibility as a magazine. So here's my conversation with Ben Norquist on Christianity Today. Ben Norquist, welcome to Across the Divide. It's good to have you here with me.
Thanks, Daniel. Glad to be here.
You just ran the Chicago Marathon, right? How did that go?
Indeed, I did. Indeed.
How was it?
26.2 grueling miles.
Okay. You're a hardcore runner, right? This is a serious part of your life.
I do. I do like running. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I discovered that about 3 years ago. I ran the Chicago Marathon 3 years ago with World Vision, and so I got involved for the cause, the fundraising part, just to kind of do my part. But then I fell in love with running. It totally surprised me. I've never enjoyed running, but I kind of got past a hurdle in my training, and then I just really loved it, and now I'm a runner. Now I think of myself as an endurance runner.
Wow, yeah, this is commitment, man. I cannot do it. The first time I met you, Ben, was I think in 24. You were doing the Gaza. What was it? Pilgrimage, the Gaza pilgrimage, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, Gaza ceasefire pilgrimage.
That's right. Yeah, you were doing it in Chicago, and then I came with my wife and kid. And we that's when we met the first time, I think.
Yeah, that was one of the coldest days of the year in Chicago. It was freezing. And we did it on the lakefront.
Right, that's right. Wait, I actually hadn't met you before at Wheaton College, I think. That's the first time we met. And then we met there in Chicago. Also, you and I recently, we just were part of a team that organized the Church of the Crossroads conference. Maybe some of the listeners were there. Just briefly, what's your assessment of that conference? What can you tell us about it? How did it go?
Gosh, what to say? I mean, I'm biased. I helped plan it, but it just made my heart sing the way it turned out. People came from all over the world for it. We had more than 800 people, on site and logging in online. And I would say the people who came were just highly engaged. The other thing too is I was just really pleased, and the conference was about Palestine, and it was about, I mean, kind of maybe like the beating heart of it was we wanted to give an opportunity for American Christians to meet, hear from, build relationships with, and respond to their Palestinian brothers and sisters, and that was like, and I think we accomplished that. We had people coming hungry to hear from Palestinian Christians, and and not just like the same old folks who come to the other conferences. This felt like a wider swath of evangelicals that came.
And if you think the conversations we are having are necessary, then I invite you to consider becoming a monthly Patreon supporter of the podcast on patreon.com/Across the Divide. By sustaining our work, you also get access to various kinds of premium content like extended episode conversations, merch discounts, and private meetings with the hosts of the podcast and other Patreon supporters. So help us to continue growing our small podcast and join the beautiful community of Across the Divide by signing up at patreon.com/Across the Divide. No, it was a great gathering. I think there's a beautiful fellowship and community that came out of it, and also a lot of cool actions that came out as well. One thing maybe we can highlight and include in the show notes is the declaration that was produced by some of the American speakers and participants, and so there's a push now for that declaration to be signed. So make sure to include that in the show notes. But this is confusing. You're a marathon runner. You're a conference organizer. Can you tell us a bit about yourself? Who is Ben Norquist?
Sure thing. Yeah, I'm sometimes confused about that myself. But I grew up in the Upper Midwest. Have spent time. All my kids were born in Tennessee. I was working in Christian higher education in a Christian college in rural Tennessee there. And then moved back up here to Chicago, maybe 12, 13 years ago. My wife and 3 kids. We moved up here so that I could take a job at Wheaton College. So I was at Wheaton for 8 or 9 years, and then did my dissertation. Have my PhD in education, and I did my dissertation on higher education in Bethlehem. So Palestinian higher education under conditions of occupation and settler colonialism. What are the implications of that kind of a context for a higher education system? Was the kind of work I was doing, which actually you guys had me on a little while ago to talk about that. So
that's right.
So I'm coming back. This is number 2.
Yeah, this is great. You're one of the select few who've been on the podcast more than once. That's great. And you worked with Nimi, or the director of the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East.
Yep. Until recently, directed the network. Yeah, exactly. Really just trying to open this conversation that has been really robust in certain spaces in the church, or more robust, in maybe more progressive spaces and moderate spaces, but wanting to bring conversations about justice, specifically in the context of Palestine and Israel, to more conservative evangelical spaces with Nimi. And right now I work for Churches for Middle East Peace, which does similar kinds of work with the broader, more ecumenical swath of the church in the U.S., but also internationally as well.
Yeah. Awesome work, man. You also have a book coming out next year. Maybe we'll bring you back for the 3rd time.
Yeah, woo! I'll do it.
To talk about your book, co-authored, I think, on the land and connectedness between Palestine and the Native American experience. Really cool work. I looked at the draft, and it's a beautiful book. Okay, well, that's not the conversation we're having right now. Maybe we'll bring you back for that. Be on the lookout for that, friends. But you just had an article published in the edited volume, co-edited by Bruce Fisk and Ross Wagner, Being Christian After the Desolation of Gaza, where you discuss a very important phenomena that we noticed in Christianity Today, which is the flagship Evangelical magazine. You can tell us more about it in a bit, but you analyzed the work that has come out from that magazine, and kind of you notice some really problematic stuff that is happening there. Just so for context, for people who are not from the US or not evangelical, what can you tell us about CT, and why is this magazine so important?
Sure. Yeah, CT, at least in my circles. So I grew up in an just kind of solidly evangelical context, household. And, for insiders, that means something that's kind of nuanced and complex. For outsiders, using that term evangelical, especially recently, might bring to mind a lot of different associations that weren't really true of my background. But certainly, I still think of myself as an evangelical in a particular way, despite how that term has kind of evolved and people's understanding of it has in some ways been reduced to a certain kind of Christian nationalist posture associated with Donald Trump. But yeah, so CT it has always, from its beginning, and it was founded by Billy Graham and others in Billy Graham's circle, which might kind of give you a clue of the flavor of evangelicalism that it's seeking to express. It's not really a kind of like sold out fundamentalism. It's a little bit more of a like a cosmopolitan evangelicalism, that seeks to be engaged with the world and have conversations engaged with, between the church and the wider culture, those kinds of things that like just give it a little bit more of an open flavor than maybe other publications that we could imagine in a more fundamentalist frame. It's always aspired to do that, and it's certainly considered a flagship magazine. The company has really been built around the print magazine historically. In more recent years, they've sought to diversify that and to build out a wider kind of ecosystem of media products and even events. You can go to CT events now, and other kinds of publications. But I grew up with Christianity Today on the coffee table of friends, in friends' living rooms. When I was in college, I remember kind of really like my interest in CT heightened again when Andy Crouch became the editor. Some of your listeners may recognize that name, and I read everything Andy Crouch wrote when I was in college and was kind of into that. I remember a kind of like frame that they were using for talking about themselves and their mission. Around that time, they were talking about beautiful orthodoxy, I think was the term, or something along those lines. And it really kind of captured a longing in my heart. I recognized that what they were aiming at was something that I was looking for in an expression of church as well. Something that recognized that we're not like compelled, like we're not forced into faith. We're not argued into faith. We're not pressured into faith. We are attracted into faith, and that the world can be attracted into faith too. And that was the kind of basic posture I wanted to have as a Christian towards my community. So it was really attractive. And then just a couple of years ago, they also came out really strongly, forcefully against the kind of wave of Christian nationalism around Trump's presidency. And that made my heart sing too. And then just up until recently, and this is where the conversation is headed, but Christianity Today is missing the mark on the way that it's engaging with Gaza, especially, but with Palestine and Israel more broadly.
Right. Yeah. So politically, it would be more of the moderate evangelical kind of position. I think they came out like they have a good position towards racism, against Christian nationalism, and they're still kind of towing the line between being like a cool evangelical who cares about the world and not like bigoted, but still anchored in this kind of Billy Graham like evangelicalism.
Kind of evangelicalism. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Exactly. That's helpful. Okay. So, and it's an important one, like for you have the average CT reader would be very thoughtful evangelical who, cares about the gospel, cares about the world, and wants to be a good person. That's kind of the persona that we have here.
Yep. Yeah. And for the most part, not highly educated on Israel and Palestine. So those readers, it could be that CT is their the main way they're hearing about or thinking, at least theologically, about Israel and Palestine, which heightens the importance, I think, of what CT is saying. Even just symbolically, CT is really important. Thought of as a kind of like bellwether for where this kind of brand of evangelicalism might be going.
Yeah, and it's headed now. Well, the editor-in-chief is Russell Moore, also well-known evangelical ethicist. He was part of the SPC, holds a prominent position in conservative evangelicalism, and I think we're gonna focus on him moving forward, and also Mike Cosper. But then under his leadership, kind of when October 7 happened, he was the main person there. And as soon as the October 7 attacks happened, Russell Moore published this article basically calling Christians to support Israel against what happened. And then he continued with a series of publications that, for us and for those of us who understand a bit more about Palestine and Israel, find super problematic. Could you just kind of help us set the stage with what Russell Moore was doing in that article?
Yep. Yeah, sure. Actually, just a couple of weeks ago, Russell Moore stepped aside. He's still an editor at CT, but now the new editor in chief is Marvin Olasky, who is also a name from my childhood, because the other magazine that was always next to CT on my coffee table is called World Magazine, and that was more conservative, I would say, than CT, and also more political. So it was just kind of the flavor of it was more unapologetically conservative politics. But I mean, from an explicitly Christian perspective, kind of wedding it to that political perspective. Marvin Olasky was at World for years and years, and I believe coined the term that kind of became important in the political zeitgeist of that day, compassionate conservatism. They were trying to solve this like image problem for conservatism and for Republicans, and he helped them do it. He's now at the helm at CT. So
interesting. Okay, so it's now even veering more further to the more conservative.
I think with Olasky at the helm, it'll be more unapologetically political and conservative. So, yeah, not my favorite direction for CT. I think that it just is a departure from where CT historically has aspired to be. But anyway, so you asked about Russell Moore. He published this article. I believe it was on October 7th, the day of the attacks, calling CT readers to stand with Israel with moral clarity. And that term moral clarity was something that that kind of became a slogan for CT's editorial voice and how they talked about October 7th. And then, even in the months following, as October 7th was receding and as the war / genocide was gearing up against Gaza, there was this moral slogan, and there's a certain kind of way that we can certainly understand, or that I do, that I understand Russell Moore's impulse there on a day like October 7th. That kind of an impulse to like stand up, say something, stand with the suffering, with those who are being victimized, etc. Is there's something very Jesus-like about it, and understandable. And I remember feeling devastated on that day too, and looking around and trying to find someone articulating something that that like express what I was feeling. And his "Let's stand with Israel with moral clarity" on that day resonated with a part of what I was looking for. But given my experience, personal connections with Palestinians, and maybe a wider understanding of some of the issues at play in the region, it also was clearly incomplete, and in a way that became clear as the weeks turned into months, and as Israel started slaughtering people in Gaza.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think it makes sense. I agree with you that, yeah, okay, fine, this horrendous attack happened and people in the West, in the US, were freaking out. Like, this is insane. This is, of course, in their mind, Hamas is militarism, is Islamic terrorism. So it makes sense he would publish that. I guess the issue that many of us have with that is that it flattens the situation in Palestine and Israel into a very simple binary. And as if you think of Palestine and Israel in terms of binaries, then you're missing the point. Like, this is not an issue of binaries. It's not a biblical way. It's not a Christian way to think about the other as the evil one, because the evil one, the bad, is the one that you should destroy according to our human logic. But then, since then, and maybe we can talk about this more before we pivot to talk about Mike Cosper, he consistently maintained the same position that had flattened Palestinians, really demonized the protests at university campuses, and didn't really say much, if any. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. Like, he didn't really critique Israeli atrocities, what is now is known as a genocide. I haven't heard him talk about a genocide, and I'm sure, I don't know if you heard anything from him, but there's a very obvious pro-Israel, anti-Palestine bias that has been operative. So even though we can sympathize with his own shock on October 7th, I think it's more about the 2 years of very uncritical pro-Israel position, right?
Yep. Yeah. Well, and so the way that I've come to think about this is that actually the moral clarity that he was calling for turns out to not actually be moral clarity. It's more like moral tribalism or moral partisanship. So it's very easy on a day like that to call for moral clarity. But if you're going to be morally if your moral clarity is morally consistent, right, then you will call for that on day 2 and day 3 and day 4 and day 700. And I don't even know what day we're in right now. And that didn't happen. And so that's really the kind of crux of my critique of Russell Moore. Like you said, he really didn't come back and revisit his stance or his clarion call to people to stand with Israel. And so the last kind of clear word that CT readers have from Russell Moore is to stand with Israel.
Yeah. Even when it's a genocide, stand with Israel.
That's the message that that you have carried with you through 2 years, then that is a deep failure on Russell Moore's part. If he's going to comment on it on day 1, then he needs to update his comment,
right,
in the light of genocide. And that hasn't happened. I have seen him. He and Mike Cosper and Clarissa Mall have conversations every so often on CT's kind of flagship podcast called The Bulletin. And recently they have had some conversations that maybe we'll come back to later in this conversation to talk about. But Russell Moore, in one of those, just in the last few weeks, was kind of doing something I haven't seen him do before, which is kind of wrestle with some of what he has seen Israel do in the last 2 years that has made him feel uncomfortable. But then the turn that he made, instead of saying, oh, maybe there's a critique that needs to be made if I'm going to be morally clear here, instead he said, Israel is not doing a good job of explaining itself. Wow. So he interpreted those moments of moral disorientation that he was feeling as bad PR practice from the state of Israel.
Yeah, this is insane to me. The thing is, by the way, for the audience sake, Russell is a professional, like he's an ethicist. So his job is to think through a Christian lens on issues of ethics and morality and society and so on. So he should be driven by a very clear ethical disposition towards any of that stuff. If he's making a commentary on anything, he's not a pundit, a political pundit. He's fundamentally an ethicist. So if he's reducing the issue of PR, that Israel is not doing a good job, despite all the millions that Israel spends on its propaganda, that it's not doing a good job, this is not showing, and I say this with love, this is not showing this the honesty and self-criticism, and also just critical analysis of politics, of warfare. And it's really tragic, I think, for someone who holds a prominent position to adopt a very naive, uncritical position towards a foreign state like Israel.
Yeah. Yeah. To adopt moral partisanship or moral
Right.
tribalism.
Yeah.
That's what I see there.
And then but then continue to use the language of moral clarity. It's like, well, this is clear to me. I'm not going to think about it much. I'm not going to add any nuance to it. I'm not going to humanize the Palestinians or understand their background or the history of the conflict. I'm just going to double down on what I say. And that's going to came out in that article. I'll make sure to include the article in the show notes as well for people to reflect on it. But he gives this very simple, Israel is in this very violent neighborhood and people just hate Israel for no obvious reason, then this is this is a talking point that is obviously an Israeli one that just strips the whole conflict from any nuance, any objective analysis of what the occupation is, the apartheid of Palestinians look like, what is that doing, and the context of Hamas and Israeli support for Hamas and the horrendous, conditions in Gaza. None of that is just, Israel is dropped in, bad neighbors, good country, weird. They would be attacked, and that's kind of there's a danger there. And I would love to hear your thoughts here, Ben. If you just simplify things so much to that level, you just kind of lose any credibility to be an honest commentator, or even also as a Christian. Like, how dare you speak like this and claim that moral clarity when you are not doing the work to understand and to educate yourself?
Yeah, well, and this is where I start to think of what I noticed coming from Mike Cosper over the last few years. So Mike is also a kind of senior creative leader at Christianity Today. He produced the Mars Hill audio, what was it called?
The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill.
Rise and Fall. That's right. Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Really an astounding podcast series, well produced. A lot of people really appreciated it. I appreciated it. And that was kind of where he made his name with the CT audience.
Just to explain that, so that's how I first got to know about Mike Cosper. So this is, again, I don't want to assume the audience knows what this is, but there was this, he's still around, well-known Reformed conservative pastor by the name of Mark Driscoll. He was a pastor of a network of churches called the Mars Hill Churches in Washington State, I think. And anyway, there was a whole controversy about him, about abuse of power, about manipulation of sales of his books, about being not submitting to the board. And eventually, and Mike Cosper did phenomenal work in exposing the kind of corruption in that church. And eventually, Mark, who I think was forced to quit or he was fired, he's now, I think, down in Phoenix, I think in Arizona, but a well-produced, beautiful production, but also showed Cosper to myself and to others as a very sensible person who cares about these issues.
Nuanced, right? complex thinker, committed to justice. I mean, coming out of that, I would say, here's a guy who is willing to say hard things, probably say things that will get him, put on some people's blacklists, but for the sake of the truth and of justice. And that's not how it's turned out, how he engages with Palestine at all. And so you were kind of asking about these two different, let's just call them two different approaches to this topic. One of them is a myth-based approach that boils things down into a story that makes moral clarity really super simple and actually deeply appropriate. If these guys are evil and the bad guys, and these guys are virtuous and the good guys, and they are always that way, like in a storybook, then moral clarity is really easy. And Mike Cosper did that. I mean, it's just kind of like his modus operandi for talking about Israel and Palestine. But I'm thinking in particular about his cover article for Christianity Today, which came out spring of 2024, and the topic that he articulates for this article is about the evil ideas behind October 7th. That's what he wants to kind of expose and grapple with. And then he didn't do that at all. Basically, he told a fairy tale story in that article. And here's what he did. Like if you were to boil down his argument, he did two things in that article. He basically smeared Palestinians and their supporters by associating them with Nazis.
Very effective, right?
Basically, he started out by saying, look at the Nazis, look at Hamas, they're like cut from the same cloth. Mm-hmm. And then he went on to say, oh, and all of the Palestinians are like that too. And then he went on to say, oh, and all of the Palestinians' progressive friends are like that.
Right.
Fairy tale.
And including also ban Palestinian Christians. He specifically targets Pastor Mother Isaac and the scene of Christ in the rubble. That's and right. The Kufiya scene, so the Palestinian Jesus, the Gazan child now is Jesus. And then he attacks the Palestinian tatris, the embroidery of the Kufiya, as a symbol of terrorism and violence and so on.
Yeah.
So even Palestinian Christians did not escape.
It actually just shows a deep level of cultural ignorance on his part. Yeah. He doesn't know what he's talking about when he's characterizing Palestinian cultural goods, Palestinian cultural values, the way that he does. And I'm not Palestinian, and I can see the level of ignorance that he's displaying with that. It really is, like, I've wondered who read and signed off on that article before Christianity Today decided to put it on their cover. It's Christianity Today prides itself on having a kind of cultural sensitivity and sophistication and appreciation for the fact that the gospel takes on as many shapes and forms as there are cultural expressions in the world. But in this case, and I would say, I'm sorry to say, because of a kind of racism against Palestinians, Palestinians are okay to smear in this way. That cover article is it's a shame. It's a shame. It's a stain on CT's record.
Yeah.
And I, when I think about how he promised to unpack for people the ideas, the ideology of Hamas, and then utterly failed to do that in that article. The contrast that I have in mind is the chapter that you wrote for this book that we're talking about Hamas, in which you do promise to begin this process of coming to terms with who is Hamas. And then you are very helpful in the way that you do that. So the contrast couldn't be wider.
Okay, well, that's okay. Well, yeah. People, you can go read that article. I discuss the history of Hamas. I bring my own critique of Hamas, of its also anti-Semitism, but also try to, or some of the anti-Semitic language in its original charter, but also try to think more critically about the context of Hamas and so on. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, for me, it's different for me to think about Hamas as a Palestinian. As a Christian as well, who disagrees with political violent ideologies in general anyway. So it's easy for me to be critical, but also I can be fair. But it's a shame that someone who doesn't really know much about Palestinian history and Islam and so on could easily speak and have such a large platform to say whatever they want to say.
Yeah. Are you going to interview yourself when it comes time to talk about that chapter?
I'm avoiding. I'm avoiding being interviewed about that article, but people can read it if they want.
I'm sure there are all sorts of sensitivities around that.
Yeah,
you writing about that.
Anyway, I think the article needs to be read by everyone. I think it's important to help for people to understand all of that. I dig deep into the writings of Hamas and their political kind of religious identity and their history, and also how they think about Jews and how they think about the Palestinian solution, but also bring my own critique as a Christian to any kind of political and religious nationalism that I reject, and also violence, as for me, it's very clear to be antithetical to the gospel. And I'm not going to stand with any nation state or any political party that supports that kind of violence. Anyway, let's pivot back to Mike Kasper. Yeah, I mean, it's like, for me, I mean, you highlighted the thing about racism, which is something as a Palestinian I've gotten so used to that doesn't affect me too much, which is so normal. And it's just so sad that so many Christians are just, that's so normal for them, that an article like this would not create any pushback. There would not be, like, it's not a scandal that racism would be so overt in a publication by a very sensible person, we thought, by a very sensible magazine. So it's really tragic and just heartbreaking. Also, just for context, for people who do not know, I'm sure you know the kufiya, the scarf that Palestinians have. If you look at the patterns on the kufiya, there you have the pattern of the olive leaf, you have the pattern of the fishing net, you have the pattern of the trade routes into Palestine. Very beautiful and cultural and historical. It's what my grandpa, the farmer, the shepherd, wears to protect his face from the sun and the sand. It's what we wear when we dance. So it's a beautiful symbol of history and culture and just practicality, covering your face from the heat of the sun. But then that just gets reduced to something violent and evil, and it's just so horrendous that stuff like this is so normal. Okay, well, anyway, let's pivot to because I also want to try to unpack what is the problem here at the core of this, and also what is the better way for us to move forward. But also, Mike Kasper produced a limited series podcast, I think it's called The Promised Land. Yeah. You highlight that in your article as well. Just also, maybe this would help with the context. Mike Kasper was sent to Israel right after the attacks. He was funded by a well-known Christian Zionist, well-funded organization. We can say their name, the Philos Project, and they basically gave him this very clear narrative. They took him to the settlements that were attacked and so on. What can you tell us about this podcast and what's happening there?
Yeah, so it's a 6-part podcast. He brought the same kind of level of production quality to it that he brought to The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. It was really well produced, and it's a very listenable podcast. It's easy to listen to. Like, it's good storytelling, technique. He captures a lot of audio so that as he's telling the story or we're hearing the clip of someone, you might hear cars go by or someone pouring a cup of coffee. It like kind of drops you into the scene. The problem is it is again a kind of embodiment of this of his way of seeing this in a storybook fashion. So there are just clear good guys, clear bad guys. I will say he has a little bit more experience in Israel, like traveling in Israel and Palestine, than this. Like, this wasn't his first trip there, but and I don't have clear details on when else he's been and who else he's been with, but in the podcast, he does acknowledge, after the first couple of episodes, he does acknowledge in the credits that they had, I think they say something like limited production help or something from the Philos Project. But I have a little bit further insight too, because I happen to be on the phone with one of the Palestinians who are interviewed in that podcast moments after that interview took place. I was calling them about something else, and he was like, "Hey, do you know a guy named Mike Kasper? He was just in my office, and he was just interviewing me," that kind of a thing. And he said that he walked Mike out of the building and looked down the street, and there was Luke Moon kind of skulking just down the road, like waiting for Mike to come out. But he didn't want to come into the college or be close to this Palestinian. And Luke Moon is the director of the Philos Project. So it is clear that the Philos Project was taking Mike around, at least to some of the sites that he was visiting where he was doing these recordings to produce the podcast. Another Palestinian who was also interviewed in that podcast told me that Mike was really unfriendly, and and showed no interest in actually listening to understand. And I take those kinds of experiences seriously. That's a kind of like evaluation of Mike's fundamental approach to this topic, and it shows in the product. Just on the level of representation, like whose voices are being heard in this podcast. Across 6 episodes, there are 4 Palestinians who are interviewed out of about 18 or 19 interview subjects, depending on how you count. And all 4 of those interviews are in a single one of those episodes.
So five episodes just can highlight the Israeli perspective, right? Point of view.
Yes, but here's the thing: it's not just Israelis talking about Israel for those 5 episodes. It's also Israelis, Zionists, really Zionist Israelis talking about Palestinians. So the vast majority of the time in that series, when Palestinians are being talked about, it's not Palestinians who are talking about it. It's people whose position in Israeli society demonstrate a kind of committed ideological Zionism. They're the ones who are characterizing Palestinians for Christianity Today listeners.
Yeah.
Which I see as and that's not bad faith journalism. That is bad faith journalism.
And also you highlight at least one of the settlers, just very clear anti-Palestinian racism in his speech, and that was never challenged by Cosper, right?
Yeah. Episode 5 is about settlers and settlements, and the overall effect is, at best, settlers come off as a kind of curiosity, not as a deep, as a subject of deep moral critique. At worst, they come off as doing the Lord's work, reclaiming this land for God and Israel. And there's no sense, there's no room in the way that this story of settlement and settlers are being talked about to wrestle with the brutality of settlers. Even today, just in the last few days, there was a brutal settler attack against Palestinians in their villages. Just outside their village, they were picking olives. And there was a brutal attack. There was a woman who was clubbed on her head and sent to the hospital.
We saw the video of that too.
Critical condition. It's really brutal.
Yeah, it was filmed by an American journalist who was there with the Palestinians.
Yeah. Right. There's no space in this whole episode about settlers for talking about settler brutality, and there's no space in the wider series given to Israeli brutality or criminality or atrocities.
Or Palestinian rights, claim to their lands, the land of my people, my family that we lost because of a settlement, and any kind of care for the equality or justice or freedom for the Palestinians.
Yeah. So again, I ask, is that moral clarity or is it moral partisanship that's coming through?
Yeah. Okay. Well, we need to wrap this up then, Ben. How do you explain? First, before we think of the solution, as we conclude, how to engage better with this issue, how to be better neighbors? How do you what's your assessment to this really bad take from some good people, some good Christians? We think they're good Christians. They have very respectable positions on a lot of other issues. Why is there such a clear moral failing, you think, when it comes to this issue?
There is a layer of one of the layers to that, to the answer to that question is about social incentives. Because I think in American evangelicalism, the incentives built and the disincentives, like the threats, are all built in one direction, to give Israel the benefit of the doubt, to not look at Israeli brutality, to not look at Palestinian humanity. If you do those things, you will be safer socially, maybe economically. You won't, like, people lose their jobs for going the other direction sometimes, or lose donations, or lose, like, they get punished.
Get canceled, yeah.
Get canceled, yeah. So in this, we're talking about like this kind of sphere of evangelicalism. Those incentives they need to be readjusted to be more like Jesus, really.
And there's a concern, I would suppose, because Christianity today, maybe there's a financial interest as well. Mm-hmm. Because of previous positions they've taken, it makes more sense for them to shift to the right to maintain some kind of financial support.
Yeah, and I guess, CT says they're a magazine that's all about Jesus. Right. And when I look at the life of Jesus, I see someone who frequently, like, for the sake of love, made decisions that exacted those kinds of social costs.
Yeah. So our appeal to Christianity today, I don't know if they would listen to this, probably not. Maybe someone from the audience would forward this to them. But our appeal to them, and you can join me here, is at least admit wrongdoing. Maybe before then, maybe educate yourself, maybe talk with Palestinians. I think the point, I don't know if you mentioned this about the podcast, like, the Palestinians were challenged frequently, and then the Israelis, the 15 Israelis were not challenged, and their narrative was just given free roam. Yeah, here, just tell us your perspective. But the Palestinian, the one under occupation, the one who's disempowered, is the one who's challenged. And I think we just have to first just acknowledge this bias that is there, and repent and do better. And again, we said this, like, it makes sense you would want to stand with Israel when it's under attack, but when Israel is committing a genocide, when we've seen the emaciated children, when we saw the destruction and the shootings and the famine, shouldn't we as Christians, but also as people with humanity? And this is where Christianity becomes so problematic to me. Sometimes it is more important to be a sort of a specific kind of Christian than to be a human. It's just like to follow those clear political, ideological positions, and at the expense of our humanity. And that's just so just tragic when it comes to Christianity, and especially in that kind of version of Christianity. So that's kind of the appeal. I don't know what you would want to say to CT, and also for the Christians who are listening to this. Like, there's a temptation for us to be so reductionist and so dehumanizing in our analysis. I don't know. Any kind of thoughts you like? What's your hope for CT moving forward?
Yeah. I think that theoretically, the idea of moral clarity is fine, but it's not the moral ideal that we see in the life of Jesus. I would say embodied love is the ideal that we see there. And is Jesus your Lord, CT, when it comes to Israel and Palestine? Or does something else take his place when it comes to this particular issue?
Right.
Because when I read now, I do want to make one distinction. The journalists that are on the ground with CT and writing, the product that they create is frequently nothing like what I see from Mike Cosper and Russell Moore. And there's, like, that's another discussion that maybe we can have some other time. But in terms of the kind of mythology about this that we see coming from Israel, from Moore and Cosper, I don't see Jesus in it. Jesus is not there. And so, yeah, I guess the where that leaves me is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And that's where I end in the chapter as well. Right. I've seen over the course of 2 years, Christianity Today helping people pass by on the other side of the road as Gaza is in the ditch, as Gaza is clearly crying out for help. And there are people who are going to the ditch, who are following the tracks of the Good Samaritan and of Jesus. But CT is not helping them do that. CT, especially what I see coming from Cosper, is doing is like giving people things to whisper to themselves as they pass by on the other side of the road. Things like moral clarity. Yeah. The people in the story itself who passed by on the other side of the road were experts in moral clarity. And, they're whispering things like just war theory. Oh, like what's happening over there is actually just. And now I can pass by on the other side of the road. That's the role that CT at the editorial level has been playing. And I would say back off from that and reevaluate.
Yeah. Or the language of Romans 13, and that's kind of what Russell used in his article. The state has a right to do that. Of course, that's not how we should read Romans 13. Yeah, that's really good work. A really important work you're doing here in highlighting this for us, Ben. And this is important. And it's sad that we still have to talk about how do we as Christians respond properly to violence and evil. And it just, the parable of the Good Samaritan is a good one. The priest and the Levi, they were good people who were busy going to temple and they were righteous. They were like, I am going to fulfill my duties towards God and towards my neighbor by going to the temple. And I'm too busy. And I see this guy and I'm like, I need to get out of here. And it's just such a tragic thing that so many of us could easily be the priest and the Levi. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much, Ben. This is really helpful. I appreciate you, man. I appreciate the work you're doing. I want to have you back to discuss your work on the land. But yeah, thank you so much.
Cheers.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Across the Divide. We are so grateful for your support and interest. The hosts of this podcast are Daniel Banura, Jennifer Madrand, and myself, Abir Shahadi. Salim Anfous is our producer. Our theme music is composed by Charlie Rishmawi. To help sustain the work of this podcast, please consider becoming a financial supporter of Across the Divide. Any donation amount makes a difference, and with a donation of as little as $5 a month, you will gain access to exclusive supporter-only content. Go to patreon.com/acrossthedivide to learn more and donate. For any feedback or suggestions, connect with us on Instagram at Across the Divide Podcast. Until next time, stay curious, stay passionate, stay engaged, and join us again on Across the Divide.